I'm going to tell you something. If you two never bother me again the rest of my life, I ain't giving up that stuff. I can't. There's good friends of mine out on the say. Well, he's divorced, you have to do his stuff. That's why I said to you before, you don't understand what the boss is your boss.
And welcome back to Mob Talk Radio. We are going to get into part 2 of 13 epic mob backstories in the history of Las Vegas. So last week we spoke about Vegas in the early days, and we discussed how early mobsters pretty much had the lockdown on Vegas. While they were not traditional gangsters in the sense of Cosa Nostra, there were organized crime guys in Vegas. They controlled everything from politics to the police and more. And Vegas was just wide open, and the mob set their sights on Vegas, but it wouldn't just work overnight. So number 4 on our list is Jimmy Hoffa, the Teamsters, and Frank Rosenthal. So we begin again with Jimmy Hoffa, Frank Rosenthal, and Caesar's Palace opening with the Teamsters funding, and that year is 1966. So in the 1950s, the mob began its ascension into Las Vegas, including the Dunes, the Riviera, the Tropicana, and the Stardust. Each of these casinos were funded with Teamsters pension loans. So we have to kind of begin with Hoffa. Hoffa got his start in his teens through his job at a local grocery store. Early on, Hoffa knew that substandard wages and poor working conditions needed to change, and the idea of everyone is replaceable drew his ire. And we can all identify with that because we've all had a job where it's known from day one that you're just a peon in a group of cattle. Zero job security. Hoffa listened as people complained, and Hoffa tried to help them organize. While it didn't work out, his moxie impressed his coworkers, and by 1932 he joined the unions and ultimately left his job at the grocery store. He then would begin to lead the local 299 in Detroit. Now, I'm not going to get into a complete biographical dig on Jimmy Hoffa or Frank Rosenthal because we've done that before. If you're interested in the Jimmy Hoffa stuff, you can head over to YouTube and listen to our Kennedy series. We talked a lot about Hoffa there, and we've talked about Frank Lefty Rosenthal and multiple other shows as well. So the Teamsters were founded in 1903 and just 30 years later had over 75,000 members. And what Hoffa was able to do was consolidate local union truckers groups into regional sections. He then moved them into a national charter. By 1936, the union stood massive with 175,000 members. And 3 years later, the union had over 500,000. By 1951, 1 million plus members. So Hoffa was no slouch. And he would go to war with anybody with a bat in hand or a pipe in hand who attempted to kill the union or work without union representation. Eventually, by 1952, he is named the national vice president. Tony Salerno, former Genovese front boss, would send a guy by the name of Marvin Elkine to be Hoffa's bodyguard and driver. And it's in those early days in which Hoffa rubbed elbows with gangsters, as Hoffa had no problem using gangsters to rough up people who spoke out against the union. Originally, however, gangsters were 100% against unions. So it wasn't always a rosy relationship, but it ended up becoming that. So Jimmy's relationship with the Mafia goes back to his early 20s. Jimmy Hoffa would meet Alan Dorfman through Santo Perone, who was a captain within the Detroit Mafia. Alan was working with Joe Glimko, Sam Giancana, and Paul Lucia. The exact relationship foundation actually came through Paul Dorfman, who was Alan Dorfman's brother. That's how they met. And it was through Paul Dorfman that he meets Alan. And then Hoffa sort of begins to accept kickbacks from Dorfman. And like I said, we're not going to get into the entirety of all of that, but Hoffa was 100% on the take. And so the biggest hotel the Teamsters backed at the time was Caesar's Palace. It opened in 1966 with 68-room occupancy. Frank Lefty Rosenthal was placed in Vegas by Chicago to be the pit boss. And it wasn't just that casino, it was 3 others as well. Frank Rosenthal grew up in Chicago and learned early on how to best handicap sports. By the 1950s, he was working full-time with the Chicago Mafia. He also had the biggest bookmaking operation in the United States, based in Cicero, Illinois. He would eventually be arrested and charged and would leave Chicago for Florida. He maintained the same abilities in Miami, but eventually, at the prodding of Jackie Cerrone and Fiore Bussieri from Chicago, he left and went to Vegas to run the Stardust. He also would run the Fremont, the Marina, and the Hacienda casinos, which were all controlled by the Chicago mob at the time. He opened the first national sports book, and the mob made a killing. And it wasn't just his expertise in bookmaking, but the cooking of the books and ensuring that the skim heading back east was taken care of. The fact that Rosenthal didn't even have a fucking gaming license and was controlling 4 different casinos is fucking insane. So what are the pension loans and how did that all work? And I think it's important to know that. So the $2.2 billion CSPF was founded in 1955 by Teamsters President Jimmy Hoffa, who viewed it not as a fiduciary responsibility, but as a means of winning friends and influencing people, politicians, and more. Hoffa moved funds into banks whose backing could be useful to the Teamsters, then would invest in Florida real estate instead of stocks and bonds, and made a substantial loan to gangsters who were partners in Las Vegas casinos and Southern California real estate developments. So when Hoffa gets jailed in March of 1967 for defrauding the pension fund, he turns the CSPF, which is the Teamsters Fund, over to Alan Dorfman, who had a long-standing connection with the Chicago mob and had profited enormously from business deals with Hoffa and from acting as the exclusive for the CSPF's insurance. Dorfman increased the fund's assets from $400 million to nearly $1.5 billion in the early 1970s. When he was jailed in 1972 for accepting kickbacks, Alvin Barron took over the CSPF, but landed in jail for the same exact reasons. During all of these regimes, at least 2 of the Teamsters' highest officers, who were also trustees of that pension fund, were closely associated with the mob: Roy Williams of Kansas City and William Presser of Cleveland. So I want to talk about Caesar's Palace opening and sort of how that all happened, and we'll just go through the Teamster stuff. So the grand opening of Caesar's Palace was in August of 1966. It was a spectacle unlike anything that Las Vegas had ever seen. The owners of the casino, a southern brash hotelier and gambler named Jay Sarno, and his straight-laced partner Stan Mullen, dropped over $1 million on food and booze, doling out 50,000 glasses of champagne and 2 tons of filet mignon to their 1,400 guests. Nearly every high-rolling gambler and bookmaker in America, as well as a veritable who's who of celebrities, were in attendance. John Wayne, Johnny Carson, Maureen O'Hara, Edie Gourmet, even Grant Sawyer, the governor of Nevada, was on hand. The guest of honor, however, was someone who didn't drink, didn't gamble, and didn't much care for the ostentatious displays of wealth. Yet here he was in the middle of a 3-day christening of a $24 million Roman palace, the most expensive casino ever built up to that point in history, anywhere. His name was Jimmy Hoffa, and he was the president of the ILA, or the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, the 1.7 million member trucking transportation union. On stage, Jay Sarno would say, "We need a guy like Jimmy. Only someone with his class, his integrity, could have added a little Greco-Roman class to Las Vegas." Hoffa added a lot more than that, however. His Union Central States Pension Fund loaned Sarno and his partners $10.6 million for the construction of Caesar's Palace. Later that night, as Hoffa slept in room 1066, the nicest suite in the hotel, gamblers threw dice and pulled the arms of the slot machines, and the casino roared with excitement. Before long, the guests had won more money than the casino had in the cage. An emissary was sent to wake Hoffa up and let him know that the casino was in the hole. According to Stan Mullen, he gave us a couple million to tide us over. Eventually, the amount of the Teamsters would loan to Sarno and Caesar's Palace would balloon over $20 million. And even more in 1968, when Sarno opens his next casino, Circus Circus. Within a decade, the Teamsters would invest over $272 million in Nevada, mostly in casinos. By 1976, the Teamsters had become the gaming industry's largest financial banker and the largest creditor in the state of Nevada. Now, the relationship between the Teamsters Union and the casinos was really one of necessity. Nevada had legalized gambling in 1931, but it had never produced more than some sawdust joints of roadhouse saloons and desert backwaters, save for the city of Las Vegas, which served to entertain the scores of workers sent to Nevada to build the Hoover Dam during World War II. The Army built an airfield outside of Las Vegas, bringing a new influx of visitors to the desert. In the post-war years, the soldiers decamped from the desert. Nevada wanted more than mining as its economic driver, so it leaned its status as the only state where gambling was legal, and they embraced tourism. Entrepreneurs arrived in the early 50s to a fledgling town that was Las Vegas, hoping to build casino resorts on the highway to L.A. They needed money. Traditional banks, however, were skeptical of investing in gambling outfits. Casinos were, by their very nature, very risky, but it wasn't just too many dice landing seven on the come out roll that banks worried about. What if the state government changed its course and criminalized gambling again? What would collateralize the loans? Deck of cards? So to add to those concerns were the fact that the only people in America qualified to run a casino were those who had run illegal gambling operations, their professional resumes being essentially their arrest records. And one begins to see how unusual the challenge of trying to scale up an economic base from gambling would be. Nevada would need criminals to run their casinos and someone even more unorthodox to post up money to get the criminals started. And that's where the Teamsters sort of come in. So in 1955, Jimmy Hoffa was the leader of the Michigan Teamsters and the Central States Drivers Council, which included locals in many of the Midwest and Southern states, and had more than 170,000 members. He began negotiating with trucking companies to set aside $2 per member into the pension fund each week. Within a year, the fund grew to almost $10 million. 10 years later, the fund was bringing in over $6 million a month. Whatever Hoffa and Moe Dalitz cooked up, introduced Hoffa to the idea that the underworld would be as much of an asset as an obstacle to his union. Hoffa saw the pension fund's ability not only as it was originally intended to ensure the futures of the members of the union and their retirements, but also as a tool to build power for the Teamsters as well as for himself. In the way Hoffa described it, the pension fund offered the union a way to reward friends and make new ones. And so to accomplish that, Hoffa took control of the pension fund through stacking the board of trustees with loyalists and moving the money from government bonds, which were the standard conservative investment vehicle for most of the pension funds at that time, into real estate loans that the fund would hold directly. By comparison, a much riskier, actually, sort of investment. And by 1963, 60% of the state's pension funds, $213 million, was in real estate, and only 3% was in government bonds. And the Teamsters were essentially now operating one of America's largest banks, and Hoffa had virtually stolen discretion over who the bank did business with. And many of those customers were Mafia figures, and not without good reason. In addition to the aforementioned necessity of the mob's expertise in Las Vegas gambling industry, the Teamsters Union had other uses for friends in low places. Every strike we have with employers who really want to fight, they revert to hiring hoodlums, said Hoffa. And unless we know who our enemy is, and unless you're in a position to do something about it, you'll lose your fucking strike. In the 1930s, Hoffa's early days as an organizer, employers in Detroit often turned to the mob to break strikes. I knew guys in the Purple Gang in Detroit, Hoffa recalled in his autobiography. We fought them with bombs and billy clubs in 1935, and both sides got hurt bad. We made up our mind to meet them, get to know them, and work out an agreement under which they stay out of our business and we stay out of theirs, which is bullshit, and we know it. One of the leaders of the Purple Gang, a Jewish bootlegger, One of the leaders of the Purple Gang, a Jewish bootlegging mob, was a young man by the name of Moe Dalitz, who we talked about last week, who met Hoffa through a girlfriend. Dalitz eventually left Detroit for Ohio, where his Mayfield Road mob rose to an underworld prominence, running illegal gambling in Ohio in the 1940s. Dalitz's family was in the industrial laundry business. We talked about that last week. And in 1949, Hoffa's Teamsters had organized Detroit's laundry and dry cleaning services into that union, so they were prepared to strike in the whole city. The consortium of owners reached out to Moe Dalitz, now a powerful underworld figure, to return to Detroit to help them negotiate with Jimmy Hoffa. The two put their heads together and came up with a settlement that avoided a strike, and some have said it involved a payoff to Hoffa, though he denied it and it was never fully proven. We got a contract, Hoffa said in his autobiography, a good contract, and the Dalitz laundries lived up to it. Whatever Hoffa and Dalitz cooked up introduced Hoffa to the idea that the underworld could be as much of an asset as an obstacle. And it introduced to Dalitz the idea that the union, a strong union anyway, could be useful to the mob as well. 10 years later, Dalitz would come to Hoffa asking for a favor that would not only change both of their lives, but change the history of Las Vegas. Dalitz was trying to set up shop in the city and he needed a loan, but not for a casino. Dalitz was building a hospital. In 1959, Moe Dalitz was approached by Las Vegas realtor Irvin Malasky and Merv Adelson. Adelson would later start the Lorimar Productions, which produced hits like The Waltons in Dallas. He also married and divorced Barbara Walters twice. The two had been working to develop a hospital on a tract of land near Las Vegas. They needed new investors, and they knew Dalitz had connections to Hoffa. Together, the four of them concocted a plan that wouldn't fail. A Teamsters would loan them $1 million for the hospital, and the Teamsters and Culinary Union health funds in Las Vegas would send their members to the hospital for treatment. This gave the hospital a guaranteed influx of patients, ensured the Teamsters would be paid back on their investments, and provided a needed benefit to the growing number of union members in the city. It was seen as a real move forward because it was a major hospital, which they hadn't had in Las Vegas before, says University of Nevada, Las Vegas historian and professor and author David Schwartz. And this is when Las Vegas really was expanding from being a small town into a small city at that time. Nevada was then the fastest growing state in the nation, fueled by a rapid growth of Las Vegas from 1950 to 1960. The city grew from 25,000 to 130,000 people, more than a third of the state's population. People flocked to the city on the promise of good jobs and the casino resorts, which were going up in rapid succession, many of them financed by the Teamsters. The initial loan to Sunrise Hospital was a trial balloon. It demonstrated that the pension fund financing could enable a much larger development and than had ever been possible before, perhaps even a casino. I think we did have a role in the transition period from the syndicate with a small funding of casinos, where you basically get a group of 50 or 60 people together and they all pull their money together and you build your casino. To more mainstream lenders, said Schwartz. He says that having a large-scale and regulated financial institution like the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund backing those projects brought a sense of legitimacy to casino developments that helped attract the attention of more mainstream financial institutions. At the time, the Teamsters were a major union, a major financial force, and these things could be audited. However, just because they could be audited didn't mean that they necessarily were, or that their findings were needed. The Teamsters put the money up to finance the Stardust, the Fremont, the Desert Inn, the Dunes, the Landmark, the Four Queens, the Aladdin, and eventually Caesar's Palace and Circus Circus, with organized crime leaders mainly involved either overtly or covertly in every single one of them. Many of these loans, according to Steve Brill, author of the 1978 book The Teamsters, were often made if a debt for past organizing favor could be settled. Hoffa used the fund to work out a quid pro quo with the underworld figures in a position to help that union elsewhere, and added strings to the loans in Las Vegas that helped the unions there as well. And these projects were bold in scale and ambition and required tens of thousands of employees. And to say nothing of the scores of building trades of workers who built the massive resorts. And they built each property and hired the workers' staff along with that. The casino signed a union contract. According to the University of Hawaii professor James Kraft, author of the book Vegas at Odds, the Teamsters made loans to entrepreneurs who provided jobs for its members, not to groups that resisted the unions. So the whole time Jimmy Hoffa is doing this, he's doing it because he gets his union in, so that's more money for him. These unions are also controlled, many of them by organized crime, so it was just sort of a huge money grab. So those union contracts that we just mentioned, both with the Teamsters, represented valets, taxi and limo drivers, front desk clerks, and culinary unions, which represented the hotel and restaurant staff, were mostly negotiated by none other than Sidney Korshak, a Chicago labor lawyer with ties to organized crime. Korshak was frequently used to settle disputes between the unions and employees whenever one or both sides of the negotiations involved organized crime interests. He worked both sides of the fence, and often his tactics were involved in bringing friendlier unions to undercut a more militant one or to negotiate a weaker contract. Still, every negotiation always ended in a contract. And while some corporate lawyers advised their clients to do all they could to break the union, Korshak tried to help expand the ranks of labor and thereby the pension funds that were bankrolling America's gambling industry. So why does a guy out of the bartenders union or the janitors union like him? Asked Herman Blackie Levitt, a vice president of the Hotel Employees, Restaurant Employees Union, the parent union of the culinary. I'll tell you why. Because whoever Sidney Korshak represents, the union officials know that they're going to come away with an agreement. He doesn't believe in breaking unions. And the contracts weren't complex, merely 6 pages, 5 or 6 articles of boilerplate. And rank-and-file workers paid little to no role in their negotiations, but the power of the union was evident. Housekeepers in Las Vegas made a base pay of $16 a day, while that was the ceiling in New York, Chicago, and L.A. Las Vegas bartenders made $27 a day compared to $17 to $21 in the same three major cities. In the post-war year, Las Vegas grew, and the average earnings of Nevada's workers also grew at a rate faster than the national average. So by 1969, there was an outstanding 275,000 people living in Vegas, and in the 20-year period from 55 to 75, and casino employment grew from about 8,000 to 40,000, by far the city's largest industry. So the Teamsters and Jimmy Hoffa played a bigger role in Las Vegas' story than just banking rolling casinos. Sorry, somebody was at my door, so I had to answer that. All right, so where were we here? Of the first 9 loans the Teamsters made in the city, 4 went to Moe Dalitz and his partners. After Sunrise, they used Teamster money to develop Maryland Parkway, the 2-lane road that Sunrise Hospital was built on, into a commercial thoroughfare anchored by Boulevard Mall, the first modern shopping mall into Las Vegas, as well as a later developing the Las Vegas Convention Center. Their company, Paradise Development Company, built hundreds of homes around Las Vegas. Much of the mob's multi-billion-dollar take is reinvested in legitimate business such as real estate, reads a 1985 Reno Gazette-Journal investigation into organized crime's influence in Nevada, cloaking themselves in legitimacy and unabashedly doling out huge contributions to charitable causes, their largest, that has brought the respect to many quarters of the state's power forces as they wedge their way to respectability. The paper bemoaned the benign indifference shown to the mob by Las Vegans, saying that locals viewed the mob as a mysterious, benevolent force that has helped build the state to what it is today. So people flocked to Las Vegas on the promise of good jobs in the casino resorts and were going up in rapid succession, many of them financed by the Teamsters. The feds, however, were immune to this mysterious force. The election of JFK to the presidency also elevated his brother Bobby to the attorney general, who sought to do what the FBI and Senate committees that he once staffed failed to do, rein in the Mafia. In the 1960s, organized crime had infiltrated every level of civic life in America, from controlling major industries into the corruption of public officials, from the White House to the dog catcher, creating what Tennessee Senator Estes Kefauver had described in 1950 as a secret international government within a government. Bobby Kennedy knew that the mob's main source of money was gambling, and that they had grown their industry from backroom dice games to full-fledged luxury resorts in Nevada, where mob leaders were skimming millions upon millions of dollars every year from those profits. Kennedy also knew that they couldn't do any of it without the Teamsters, so he assembled the best lawyers and investigators he could to find into what was dubbed the Get Hoffa Squad. Their mission was made difficult by Hoffa's immense national popularity. Despite widespread perceptions of corruption, Hoffa was still seen as a champion of the underdog. When Hoffa was first elected Teamsters president in 1957, his predecessor, Dave Beck, had already been indicted for misusing union funds and would eventually go to prison in 1962 for filing a false income tax return. Hoffa was considered a continuation of Beck's corrupt leadership by the rest of the labor movement, and the AFL-CIO president, George Meany, led a vote to oust the Teamsters from the AFL-CIO. It passed by a margin of 5-1. Over time, Hoffa did little to change the impression that he was corrupt, and even less to integrate himself to the broader labor movement. Under Jimmy Hoffa, the Teamsters raided other unions and swooped in to negotiate sweetheart contracts with companies that had been organized by the AFL-CIO unions. But Hoffa also grew the Teamsters into the largest union in America, and he had helped to make over-the-road trucking one of the most dangerous and low-paid jobs in the country, to a well-paid middle-class job that afforded drivers their own homes, cars, and luxury of a pension in retirement. Across the country, and especially in Las Vegas, Jimmy Hoffa was seen as somebody who used his power, however corrupt, to beat the bosses and win for the workers. Ronald Goldfarb, a member of the Get Hoffa squad, wrote in his memoir that perfect villains, imperfect heroes, that civil libertarians, and, it seemed, most outside of the justice I knew, all thought Hoffa was being stalked unfairly. But Goldfarb and the rest of the Kennedys team knew there was no other way to take down the mob if they didn't go through Hoffa, however popular he might have been at the time. If gambling was a multi-billion-dollar bank for organized crime, he wrote, Las Vegas must have been its Federal Reserve. And Las Vegas was the engine that drove the Mafia, and the Teamsters were the engine that drove Las Vegas. So over the course of the 1960s, Jimmy Hoffa battled Bobby Kennedy investigations in multiple jurisdictions. He was investigated for misuse of the pension fund, bribery of jurors, violence and intimidation of union enemies, defrauding members, payoffs to criminals, and everything else Kennedy and his squad could find. In 1967, they finally got the charges to stick, and Hoffa was sent to Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania to do 13 years for bribery, fraud, and jury tampering, a mere 7 months after he attended the opening of Caesar's Palace. Putting Hoffa in prison didn't stop the mob, however. Las Vegas continued to grow, and the Central States Pension Fund continued to loan out more and more money. In fact, Hoffa's successor, Frank Fitzsimmons, was more accommodating to the mob than Hoffa had ever been. Under Frank Fitzsimmons, the Central States Pension Fund was loaning out more money than ever before. And it wasn't Fitzsimmons' doing, however. As Hoffa prepared to go away, he made it clear that Alan Dorfman, an employee of the pension fund and ties to the mob, would make decisions on who would get loans. 3 weeks after Hoffa went to jail, the fund passed a resolution making Dorfman a special consultant. And the 10 years after Hoffa went to prison, the Central States Pension Fund tripled in size. The high water mark for the pension fund's investment in Las Vegas came in 1976, with $272 million in loans, $249 million of which were in the casinos. So the Teamsters held 56% of the loans in Clark County, including perhaps the most famous loan pension fund ever made, the $62 million loan to a 32-year-old real estate agent by the name of Alan Glick to buy the Stardust. The story of Glick, the Stardust, and its unraveling is dramatized in Nick Pileggi's book Casino and in Martin Scorsese's film in the same name. In many ways, the Stardust was the last stand for the Mafia and the Teamsters Central State Pension Fund in Las Vegas. Glick, armed with what eventually totaled $160 million in Teamsters loans, bought 4 casinos for a consortium of Midwest mob leaders and allowed them to skim the casino for untold millions of dollars. Bobby Kennedy knew the mob couldn't skim casino profits without the Teamsters, so he assembled the best lawyers and investigators he could find into what was dubbed the Get Hoffa Squad. Since the election of Kennedy and the ascension of his brother Since the election of Kennedy and the ascension of his brother to the country's top cop, the federal government had tried and failed to pry the mob from gambling industry for more than 20 years. They would lock up mob leaders and union leaders, and others would simply take their place. Instead, the government needed to prevent the flow of money to starve the mafia out. It would take decades and a number of laws to get passed during that time to give them the tools to be able to do that. The Corporate Gaming Act opened the door in 1969 for publicly traded corporations to purchase casinos, which in turn brought the attention to skimming operations at mob-held casinos where profits were lower. The following year, the RICO Act enabled the government to investigate and charge 15 people for conspiracy in the skimming operation at the Stardust, including all the leaders of the Kansas City, Chicago, and Milwaukee Mafia. And the 1974 Employee Retirement Income Security Act enabled the Justice Department to more closely monitor the Central States Pension Fund. After discovering a shady deal involving the purchase of a private jet by the fund in 1979, the government and the Teamsters worked out a consent decree that would allow the government to assume control and oversight over the Central States Pension Fund, and the lid was quickly tightening on the mob. The government turned the Central States Pension Fund over to Morgan Stanley in 1983. Within 2 years, Morgan Stanley had completely divested it from Vegas, declaring that casinos were not the investment-grade assets that we want. They shifted the investments to 49.7% stock and 46.2% bonds and only 2.3% in real estate. In the 1970s, before the fund was taken over, the fund still took in more contributions from employers each year than it paid out in benefits to its 450,000 members. At the time the government took control of the fund, it was the largest private multi-employer pension plan in America with $6.4 billion in assets. And that would all start to change after the passage of the Motor Carrier Act in 1980. Deregulation of the trucking industry was a goal of every presidential administration since Kennedy, Republican and Democrats alike. The Teamsters had broken ranks with the majority of the labor movement in 1960 to support Richard Nixon and had kept a much cozier relationship with Republicans throughout Hoffa's tenure. And that closeness may have brought Hoffa to the executive clemency from Nixon in 1971 that got him out of prison with the condition that Hoffa not engage or direct or indirect management of any labor organization, but it didn't do much to slow down the deregulation. Nixon and his successor, Gerald Ford, Both signaled their support for deregulation, which would eliminate price controls and force trucking companies and thereby truck drivers to return to competing over who could pay the lowest wages, undoing decades of wage increases and membership growth sparked by Hoffa's National Master Freight Agreement. Roy Williams, who succeeded Fitzsimmons as the Teamsters president, saw the writing on the wall after Jimmy Carter's election in '76, and the Motor Carrier Act made its way throughout Congress. Williams didn't know what else to do. He called upon his friends in the Mafia for help. They suggested that they bribe Nevada Senator Howard Cannon to hold up the bill, but the plan didn't work. Williams and Joey the Clown Lombardo ended up in prison for their role in the scheme. Alan Dorfman, the mob's man in the pension fund, also was indicted in the attempted bribery. He served no prison time because he was murdered 3 weeks before his sentencing. The law passed and was signed by Carter in 1980, and the results for the rank-and-file drivers were calamitous. In the first 5 years of deregulation, 6,740 carriers went out of business, and by 1991, only 5 of the 50 largest carriers remained. From 77 to 87, wages declined by 44%. In the 1970s, Teamsters represented more than 2 million truck drivers. In the first 10 years of deregulation, they lost almost 500,000 members. Today, their numbers have dwindled to around 75,000 drivers. But the Teamsters have rebounded somewhat, organizing in different sectors like warehouses, distribution centers, and even healthcare and education to make up for the losses in the trucking industry. The Central States Pension Fund, however, hasn't fared very well. In 2017, the fund was projected to be insolvent by 2025, and that fund did fine until the government took it over, said Bruce Rayner, former president of Unite Here, an expert and consultant to unions on pension funds and capital strategies. They hired stock pickers who were paid high fees to manage it, and it was totally mismanaged to hell because they could care less about whether the workers had a pension or not. Then, when the 2008 housing crisis hit, the Central States Pension Fund lost 42% of its assets in 15 months, which amounted to about $11.1 billion. The median allocation by all union pension plans at that time was just under one half stocks, and the median among plans with over $2 billion in assets was still only 59%. And by comparison, the Central States Pension Fund portfolio was 2/3 stocks and 1/3 bonds, as the stock pickers were put in charge of the fund, made big bets on stocks as a way to solve the problem created by the dwindling number of Teamster represented employees contributing to the fund. As a result, the plan was hit much harder than any other pension plan during the crisis. The fund's appointed manager's proposal solution to this shortfall: cut benefits to retirees. They requested special permission from the Treasury Department to slash the pensions of more than 400,000 Teamsters and their families. The department denied that request. Teamster leaders then spent years lobbying for help in Washington, which finally arrived in 2021 when the Biden administration and Congress included a $36 billion bailout for the fund as a part of the American Rescue Plan Act. Had Biden not stepped in, a lot of the Teamsters retirees would have had their pensions cut, said Rayner. Rayner believes that the story of the Central States Pension Fund is so instructive one for labor today. He argues that Hoffa's use of pension fund as a tool is something more unions should actually emulate. There are numerous unions who have assets over $1 billion. We've got massive resources, he explained. That institutional investors that account for roughly 90% of the public markets are trading money that belongs to the pension and retirement plans like the UAW or the public sector workers. That money, in Rayner's view, would be far better used to the labor movement if it was moved out of the public markets and into private ones. Unions could then adopt a set of labor standards for companies in their financing, managing their money the way Hoffa managed the Central States Pension Fund, that is, investing with strings attached. Jimmy Hoffa leaves prison in 1971 after Nixon commutes his sentence, with the stipulation that he does not run for a Teamster office again until at least 1980, a stipulation that Hoffa fought unsuccessfully in court. In 1975, he vanished, presumed to be murdered by the Mafia, a case that still puzzles and fascinates the public to this day. His disappearance and his crimes have defined who he was. His greatest achievement within the Teamsters, like negotiating the union's first nationwide master contract for truck drivers, have long come unraveled. His union, once powerful enough to bring industry and government to its knees, is a shadow of its former self. The Las Vegas of today, however, towers in comparison to the Las Vegas of the 60s and 70s. The Las Vegas metropolitan area has over 2 million residents. There are 60 major casinos, and nearly all the top casino resorts are still union shops, with wages that are anywhere from 14 to 39% above the national average, depending on the job. The casino resorts today are owned by major corporations that are publicly traded, and gambling companies are no longer considered not investment-grade assets or too risky to get a loan from the traditional bank. In fact, Americans spent $54.9 billion on gambling in 2022 alone, more than ever before in the history. And Nevada gamblers wager over $1 billion a month. Visit Las Vegas today, and you'll likely ride from the airport in a union taxi. Hoffa loaned the checkered cab company $225,000 in 1962, and Vegas is one of the few cities that still has union cabs. Be checked in by a Teamster front desk clerk. Be served by a wine and union sommelier. Once a mob-run union, is the largest and most powerful union in Nevada, the Culinary Union. Runs a fine dining and hospitality training program for its members. Have your room cleaned by a union housekeeper. Your drinks served by union cocktail waitresses and bartenders. And despite Nevada's anti-union right-to-work laws and declining union density across America, Las Vegas is still very much a union town, particularly in the casino industry. And while Hoffa would be crestfallen at the state of the American labor movement today, he probably wouldn't be surprised to learn of the success of Las Vegas, as Jack Goldsmith writes in Hoffa's Shadow, even in those days before the grand opening of Caesar's Palace, as he awaited word on his impending prison sentence. Hoffa roamed the halls of the vast casino, chatting with and encouraging the laborers who were putting on the finishing touches, and occasionally getting on his knees to even help them. Goldsmith quotes Chucky O'Brien, Hoffa's foster son. He would go in and help electricians screw in the wall lights and plug covers and shit just because he wanted the hotel to open properly. He was so proud. Caesar's Palace is still in operation on the Vegas Strip. It's still a union shop. From a good union jobs to the hospitals to the parks and neighborhoods built with Teamsters money. Perhaps Las Vegas is the most lasting legacy of Hoffa after all. And that's just the truth. And it just goes to show that, Jimmy Hoffa was triple dealing, quadruple dealing, but it was good for Vegas too, until it wasn't. And like I said, when everybody got caught up in the Teamsters pension loan, even though the Teamsters pension loan and what they were doing and defrauding, even though it's illegal and it was bad, it was still better for Vegas. The workers were paid better. And so Jimmy Hoffa, through his brash sort of behavior, did a lot of things for Vegas, but everything that Hoffa did was in his interests. Everything that Frank Rosenthal did for years, or Moe Dalitz, were in their interests. And don't get it twisted. Jimmy Hoffa was a gangster. In every sense of the word, Jimmy Hoffa was a gangster. And that, my friends, is number 4 on the most epic mob backstories of Las Vegas. All right, so that being said, we're going to come back next week with part 3, and we are going to be live on Sunday night at 8 o'clock. We will see everybody then.